Video game worlds have come a long way in the last few decades, haven't they? Where once we were expected to believe that this teeny tiny castle, 4 houses and a shop was somehow a sprawling metropolis, now games can conjure up entire full-scale cities for us to play in, decorated with crowds of people and more digital real estate than we could ever hope to explore. Once upon a time, the closest we got to a video game world that felt as varied and as packed with life as our real one was a slightly different floor tile set and a different colour of slime every few levels. But now, games can throw a seemingly endless variety of gorgeous photorealistic vistas at us, each filled with new and interesting creatures and places to look at. And where previously we had to make do with, at best, a sentence of backstory as to why we were even going on an adventure in the first place, something that usually amounted to, "There is an evil wizard, kill him please," now video game worlds are so richly detailed and stuffed with story that their cutscenes alone rack up more runtime than a full TV series. Essentially, with every year that's gone by since their invention, video game settings and environments have only gotten bigger, more detailed, and increasingly visually impressive, with ever larger teams dedicated to the sole duty of bringing these digital spaces to life and making them somewhere where you actually want to spend your time. For a fan of world building like myself, you'd think that there's never been a better time to be into video games. Unfortunately, things are a bit more complex than that. Good world building is one of those things about games that's not particularly visible or flashy, but can do so much to elevate a title that's merely okay into something truly special. And for people who are a bit confused by what I mean when I say world building, basically what I'm talking about is the construction not of a story, but of the fictional world that the story takes place in. If you've ever been really enjoying a good book or a TV show or a movie or whatever and realised that you aren't just into the narrative itself, but are fascinated by the setting and the history and the wider world of this fictional reality, then you've enjoyed some solid world building. Have you ever wanted to, explore the nooks and crannies of the USS Enterprise, or wrap your head around the weirdly complicated history of Middle-earth, or have a go in Baron Harkonnen's Big Black Bubble Bath? All this stuff that's not directly relevant to what's happening in the plot, but serves to flesh out and enrich the time and place it's happening in, is all world building, and this behind-the-scenes narrative art could turn a mere investment in a single story into a fascination with an entire world, and video games are no different. The problem is, though, that for all the money, technology, and man-hours video games put into building worlds, they're still not very good at it. How many times have you found yourself groaning when a game's designated exposition dump character sits you down and rambles out some painfully unoriginal backstory you couldn't care less about that instantly goes in one ear and out the other? How many times have you been plonked in a city that took hundreds of people years to assemble and been unable to see it as anything other than a hollow artificial facade in front of a glorified menu that you can't wait to get away from? And perhaps worst of all, isn't it weird how despite decades of advancement in making gaming worlds look, sound, and behave more believably, it's often the ones with the most functional presentation and the sparsest writing that suck us in the most effectively. Essentially, for every video game with a compelling and well-realized setting, there are 100 generic, boring, and poorly conveyed ones lying in wait to ambush us with some frustratingly unrealized potential. So, what's going wrong here? Why is world building for video games so uniquely difficult, and what are the games with great settings like Mass Effect, Cyberpunk, Disco Elysium, and Bioshock doing right that nobody else is? Well, I think it all comes down to the fact that both we as an audience, and game developers too, tend to prioritize all the wrong things when it comes to world building. So much of our focus seems to be on making worlds that feel larger, more detailed, and more grounded in reality than ever before, on explaining every last historical footnote with boatloads of lore, and making sure entire continents are fully explorable. And while this push for completely comprehensive world design is commendable, this obsession with lore, with all the background facts, history, and explanations of a setting, is hurting world building more than it helps. That's because any given setting is only engaging when we have a reason to care about a particular time and place, and an investment in discovering more about how this particular world works. And without that stuff, it doesn't matter how good a game's lore might be, it won't mean anything to us as an audience. For example, people wouldn't be, if anything, a bit too invested in the lore of Game of Thrones if they didn't start by thinking Ned Stark was a cool hero who wasn't going to die, and wanting to learn more about his relationship with the king and Jon Snow. And without that initial emotional buy-in, or if a setting manages to lose our investment, then all the background details of a world just become informational noise that we have no reason to actually care about. Basically, world building is about more than just building a world, as weird as that sounds. It's also about getting us to care about a fictional setting and rewarding that psychological investment by giving us cool new things to find out about. And games can do this without super high fidelity graphics, pages of backstory, or even any sense of realism. The only thing that games actually have to do to build a good world is to make us give enough of a shit about this made up nonsense that getting to see more of it becomes its own reward. Needless to say, that's easier said than done. So, Let's start with the basics, shall we? How can games get us interested enough in their settings in the first place for us to start caring about them, and thus about getting to explore all the cool lore they've cooked up? Well, there are a variety of ways, but in my experience, the best world-building centric games hit the player hard and fast to get them engaged right away. This is important, because any world building that floats across our screens before we care about it, at best may as well not exist, and at worst us players will find actively boring. Way too many games, in particular really long or cinematic ones, are so obsessed with front-loading their lore in order to set up their big reveals and lay future plot threads, that they kind of forget to get us to care about it first, meaning that all their effort ends up being for nothing. Final Fantasy XIV, for example, has a really interesting setting with loads of cool places to discover later in the story, and in particular the expansions, but all that cool world building and story reveals are dependent on stuff you learn in the awful main story quests from the base game. So most people reach the actually interesting areas having mentally switched off 100 hours ago, and are totally unable to appreciate how cool places like Ishgard or Amurot actually are if they ever reach them at all. Conversely, Final Fantasy XVI starts you off right away with some fun characters, some intrigue, and a big fight between two cool elemental monsters to get you interested in what's going on immediately. Does Final Fantasy XVI have a better world than Final Fantasy XIV? No, of course it doesn't, but I wager more people were able to enjoy it because it's much more effectively introduced. I think as a rule of thumb, the most effective way to get us as players to care about world building is to use something that's easier to emotionally invest in as a sort of psychological beachhead, easing us into a setting through something that we already care about. For example, strong character writing, which is much easier to create a bond to, can immediately get us invested in a setting because it affects the little pretend digital people that we already like. Look at BioWare's cast of characters, for example. The games almost always use your party members to introduce you to key world building points that the writers want you to A, know about, and B, care about. In Mass Effect, each party member doesn't just fill you in on their species, but a world-building idea that's relevant to their own personal narrative. Tali's all about the Geth Quarian War, Garrus hates the Council's bureaucracy, Mordian made the genophage, Kaidan's all about biotics, Ashley is all about humans being racist space rednecks, etc. By explaining their world-building, particularly the basics through characters, games can be much more confident that we'll actually remember it, and we'll be able to reach that all-important tipping point where we become knowledgeable and invested enough in the world itself that it can start to stand on its own. Similarly, a nice, compelling mystery can get the player immediately invested in the kind of questions that draw them deeper into a world. In Pentiment, which takes place in what should be the unbelievably dry setting of a small rural village in Renaissance-era Germany, the game instantly gets you to care by having you try to solve a murder, something that, coincidentally, requires getting to know the town and its history. And in Baldur's Gate 3, you wake up with a worm in your face and have no idea what it does, why you have psychic powers now, or how to get rid of it, which instantly sets the adventure off on a great pace and gives you a reason to care about all the information you learn. Sometimes, however, games don't need to be quite so sophisticated with their writing, and can just get players into a world with a nice, big, blunt emotional appeal. Warhammer is the undisputed king here. You don't need to know any other lore to find the idea of space skeletons, or alien football hooligans, or this guy on his big gold toilet cool. And this simple fascination can propel you way over the hump of needing to understand boring faux Latin and imperial politics, neither of which are particularly interesting to start off with. But even in games that don't have decades of tabletop backstory to support them, novelty goes a long way towards getting us to care about the world. The games of the Fallen London universe, which take place in a subterranean, deathless version of Victorian London, are incredibly compelling right out of the gate in spite of their pretty slow gameplay, because the setting is so unique that you instantly want to find out more about it. Ditto goes for Horizon's wacky world of robot dinosaurs, where you end up stumbling into some actually pretty good backstory in your childish quest to learn more about the big cool monsters. It's not just outright coolness that can get people into a game setting though. Any emotional appeal can work. I certainly wouldn't care anywhere near as much about researching the fictional setting of Suzerain, a political RPG, if it didn't saddle you with a ruined economy, imminent war, and an assassination attempt to deal with right at the start, pushing you to really dig into the setting in order to find a solution. Equally, despite some pretty minimalistic writing, Frostpunk has this amazingly compelling world because it so cleverly gets you into the desperate shoes of your citizens. Discovering the ruins of Tesla City and Winterhome hits so hard because that grisly fate is on the horizon for you too, and the crazy things your society does to adapt to the cold have real grounding in your own stressed out decision making. If caring about something is the key to the success of world building, regardless of whether we're fascinated, soothed by, or driven to madness by a setting, it's when we feel nothing for a world that things start to go wrong. And unfortunately for games, nothing shatters our faith in a setting faster than the impression that our interest in it isn't worthwhile. When we have questions about a world that don't get answered, or when we start to see the cracks in the fictional facade that remind us that this is all just a bunch of polygons, it becomes way harder to emotionally invest in a setting because it doesn't feel substantive enough to be worth our time. Therefore, it's critically important for games to not just get us interested, but protect our investment in a world. And this means always having a response to any sort of question we might have about a fictional setting. This is why many of gaming's best built worlds are dense rather than broad. It's much easier to design a seamless world when it's contained within a small area. Look at Prey's Talos 1 space station or Bioshock's Rapture. These worlds feel so alive and so plausible, not because they are in any way realistic, but because they're so crammed full of authentic feeling details that each one can support the others, and maintain the illusion of a coherent world much more effectively. Prey's detailed crew manifest, and its little environmental stories lit all over the place, such as these people who were in a D&D game when disaster struck, give the impression that this setting was lived in long before you got there. And the fact that Bioshock's ruined buildings never feel generic, and all clearly had some sort of pre-collapse purpose in Rapture, means that the setting can always answer any questions that you might have that would otherwise challenge the world's integrity. How does Rapture trade with the outside world? Right here. You even go there as part of the main quest. Where does its oxygen come from? All these trees in the Arboretum. What do the citizens do for fun? For frolic. Or maybe the Andrew Ryan Museum in Bioshock 2, which is also great. Sadly, games with bigger worlds just can't afford this level of complete immersion in their design. They're just too big, and nobody's got the infinite development budget. But what they can do is make sure that we only remember the parts of the game that contribute to the impression of a cohesive, well-realised setting, even if it's actually a patchwork facade at best. To use Cyberpunk 2077 as an example, the world of Night City is riddled with elements that, to be honest, feel pretty underdeveloped or like they don't really fit with the rest of the world at all. But you never realise this, because there are some brilliant highlight moments in the game that are so memorable that they make the world feel more complete than it actually is. The cops in Night City, for example, are barely a presence in the story or really in the world itself. They get less world building than some of the gangs, but you never question their lack of presence or their in-game incompetence because a few really effective cutscenes and quests that show just how scary the cops and in particular Max Tack ought to be fill in the gaps for you. Also, the incredibly well done storyline with Evelyn Parker and the dark implications of brain dance technology work in the same way. It sets the tone for that side of the world so completely that you can almost ignore the fact that some of the more interesting implications of brain dances go completely unexamined, and that sex is, paradoxically, played for laughs constantly in the game. And Cyberpunk's not the only open world that does this stuff well. Bethesda, for all their faults, are great at turning totally unrealistic settings into ones that feel very lifelike, because they're stuffed full of so many little tailor-made vignettes that they pretty much support the setting on their own. Each little encounter in an Elder Scrolls game and each dungeon in Fallout is memorable or evocative or funny enough that it takes precedence in our memory, and serves as an answer to a particular world-building question, in spite of the fact that they don't really fit together very well, and most of the stuff in between them is pretty empty or nonsensical. Like how Skyrim's much vaunted Cloud District pretty much literally doesn't exist, but this smarmy guy making fun of you about it is enough to trick you into hating him and the elitism of Skyrim's noble class instead of questioning the setting. It's when games fail to answer our questions and expose holes in their world building that everything falls apart, as it feels like we're being punished for caring about something. No matter how much lore a game may have, a world that fundamentally doesn't make sense to us, or feels like it's disrespecting our investment, will never be able to win us over. Metaphor ReFantasio has a bunch of genuinely cool worldbuilding that's explored as part of the main quest. Don't worry, I won't spoil it. But the side stories are much less well constructed. The primary motivation for your first party member, Stroll, is that his hometown and his aristocratic family were totally wiped out by monsters summoned by this sexy so-and-so. But at no point does anyone besides Stroll remark on the consequences of a regional power being wiped off the map, nor does anyone talk about what Stroll's hometown did, or literally anything else of note, giving the impression that it sort of only existed to be destroyed and wasn't really part of the larger setting, making the whole package feel frustratingly less cohesive. Equally, Starfield. Oh, you thought I was going to let Bethesda off the hook, didn't you? For all of its pretenses of realism and its boatloads of lore, there is so much about it that simply goes unexplained. Why are these colonists just standing around on an uninhabited space rock? How does Neon as a society, which is essentially a drug cartel, function as an interstellar political entity? What do the various groups think about the fact that there is an ancient precursor race handing out magic powers? We never find out, and so it makes the setting feel so hollow that all the lore the game throws at you is basically pointless, regardless of how good it may or may not be. And this brings me back to that central idea of lore, not as the be-all and end-all of worldbuilding, but as a reward for caring about and immersing yourself in a setting. If we don't make a setting worth filling with all those delicious nuggets of backstory, then creating them in the first place is pointless. And even then, there are far more ways to articulate lore-adjacent information than dry, factual Wikipedia articles and exposition dumps. By over-explaining the tiniest details and avoiding nuance, even games that do everything else right can end up building worlds that feel stiff and lifeless no matter how much context we pump into them. Look at the difference between Alpha Centauri and its spiritual successor Civ Beyond Earth. The latter has way more comprehensive backstory to its setting and loads more stuff on each faction and each leader than the game that inspired it. And yet, Alpha Centauri is completely unmatched when it comes to creating a world that feels rich and textured because it uses its very limited world count to give each character and each society a coherent worldview, one that tells us far more than objective, dispassionate information ever could. The reveals that totalitarian nihilist Yang dumps corpses back into the food supply, or that technocrat Morgan actually thinks the unsustainable practices that ruined Earth were pretty much fine, paints a far more vivid picture than paragraphs and paragraphs of backstory on how Suzanne Fielding had 2 sisters and used to be an accountant, which doesn't exactly stir the imagination, does it? In fact, many games that manage to create what feel like very rich settings actually go out of their way not to explain themselves in depth. Part of the genius of why Disco Elysium's world feels so alive even though we only get to see a tiny part of it is because the game avoids communicating an objective fact. Every character, including the player themselves, has their own take on the revolution, the monarchy, capitalism, the police, and the impending destruction of reality. So when a character like Joyce gives you the rundown on world history, you're not just being read to from a document, you're also having to decode her own biases and the things she leaves out, which gives you a much more intimate connection to Revachol and a much greater incentive to come to your own conclusion about the stuff that the game only ever implies, like whether Dolores Day was actually a spooky alien. No, I'm not kidding. This same dynamic is true for a lot of other games with really compelling settings. Rather than presenting the player with a dry, objective account, they convey a much more layered setting in a more efficient way by letting the player get their hands dirty and figure out the lore themselves. In Dishonored, for example, the plague isn't just a background lore detail, it ebbs and flows with your actions, visibly affecting the world. All the consumables aren't just generic items, but reference in-universe people and places that you can spot elsewhere, and basically all the targets and location get name-dropped constantly, both before and after you actually visit them, all serving to give the world a sense of being interconnected and alive, flowing through and around your perspective and actions. There is very little that's more boring than when the game presents you with a big, weighty digital tome and tells you to do some homework in order to understand what's going on, and all too many titles take this easy way out and don't work their lore into the setting in a naturalistic way. Ultimately, this means that most people, at best, trudge through all the boring backstory out of obligation, or at worst, won't bother finding it at all. Instead, by giving players the chance to discover lore and background details organically, games can make it a much more effective reward mechanism, rather than turning what should be a treat into a chore. Audio logs and such have become a widespread staple because they ground worldbuilding in a time and a place that the player can immediately appreciate, and give all-important texture by conveying this information through the perspective of a character in the world, rather than an omniscient codex writer, which is much more interesting. This player-centric approach to worldbuilding is also why I love anything with a scanner or a bestiary that you can poke around the world with, because it makes you feel like you're actually doing proper research on a setting rather than just being told about it. Examining creatures in their natural habitat, or piecing together the progress of the Metroid breeding project in Metroid Prime feels great because it's like you're doing actual detective work into the world, uncovering more new mysteries the more effort you put in, and the same is true for many other games with the same sorts of mechanics. In fact, now that I mention it, this is arguably part of the core appeal of Pokemon as well, and it's why its setting is so evocative in spite of the fact that it is plainly nonsense. You get to take an active role in mapping out the Pokemon's habitats, seeing how they fit into their environment, and when you catch one, you even get a cool fact about them. If that's not using lore as a reward, then I don't know what is. Additionally, games can even world build through their mechanics, something that irritatingly few games really take advantage of. By physically connecting us to their fictional worlds via their mechanics, games have a great opportunity to use mechanical friction as a vector for world building that no other medium has access to. A personal favourite example is in Persona 5. No other game has managed to get me to build up quite as intimate a relationship with the city environment, because unlike everything else, Persona 5 forces you to actually run around and visit each individual shop yourself, catch and pay for public transport, shove through crowds and manage your your schedule around what places are open. It's so much less convenient than if all of Tokyo was just one big menu, but through the friction imposed by the setting, you get a much more intimate feel of just how big and overwhelming the place really is. Equally, in the criminally unknown roguelike Caves of Qud, the desert setting of the game is heavily based around water as a currency, and rather than just making it an analog for gold pieces, Qud forces you to carry it around in flasks, drink it while you adventure, and even use it as part of a greeting ritual with people you meet, cementing its importance both in lore and in game at the same time. And one tiny example that I will always call back to is the bit at the start of Half-Life 2 where the cop makes you pick up a can for no reason and beats you if you don't. It's more effective world building than an entire book of backstory on the Combine, and I love it. Really, regardless of what kind of setting is being built, the thing that makes a lore interesting is a feeling of active involvement, where the world is communicated not just through opening monologues and lore books, but through every facet of the game. Because only then can we feel like it's our interest and our relationship with the world that matters, rather than, our attendance. All of this is to say that I think our view on world building as a topic at large is needlessly simplistic. Throughout all of gaming's history, we've been running to catch up with the stories that inspired us, creating and asking for ever bigger, higher fidelity worlds that cost more money to make and have more and more stuff in them. And while this strategy was certainly effective during the medium's earliest years, it was also only ever going to get us so far. Now that technology and budgets are no longer holding us back, video games as an art form have raced so far ahead that I think they've missed out on some foundational lessons along the way. And as a result, a lot of gaming's big, ambitious, complicated worlds end up collapsing under their own weight, and we as an audience simply aren't experienced enough to explain why that happened and why games with good world building function as well as they do. Video games as a medium for world building have so much potential. All we have to do is realise that more lore is no substitute for a setting that people feel invested in and want to find out more about on their own. Look at anything FromSoft has made. Those games have an active contempt for the idea of lore as comprehensive, direct explanation. They give you little snippets and clues, often hidden away or wrapped in symbolism, and even once you can put it all together, it's often only enough to understand like a third of what's going on. Who the hell are these guys? No idea. Who are the Outer Gods? Who turned my boy Bok into a bush? We still don't know, and it's pissing me off. And yet, in spite of the fact that these settings provide no concrete answers, we, myself included, will still dedicate hours to concocting ridiculous theories to explain these worlds and have a great time doing it. Not because of some grand lore document, but because we care about the setting and because there's just enough connecting threads between the vague nonsense to make it all feel worthwhile. And none of that would be possible if Miyazaki had simply appeared and said that it was all the doing of the great mysterious Lord of Poison Swamps the whole time. Basically, no amount of 8K textures, all-star voiced actors, and infinitely AI-generated lore are going to compensate for not understanding the fundamentals of narrative technique. Show don't tell might be the cliché writing advice that everyone gives, but when it comes to world building, games have no choice but to tell. And what that means is that they have to come up with interesting ways of conveying and getting us to care about their lore, or they risk losing our interest forever. The upside is that simply by leveraging the unique, non-linear, interactive nature of games to their advantage, developers can make worlds so rich, so unique, and so deep that J.R.R. Tolkien will posthumously throw up out of jealousy. All it requires is thinking a little bit outside the box, learning from the techniques of successful world building rather than their surface level aesthetics, and realizing that getting people to care is much more important than giving them all the answers. World building is one of fiction's nerdiest subject areas, and its reputation is well deserved. But in spite of it being associated with punishingly intricate cross-sections of spaceships and retellings of the War of the Roses with all the names changed, it also serves as the backbone of some of gaming's best experiences, because it provides us all, from lore experts to world-building tourists, with the fundamentally human joy of seeing how things fit together in ever more complex ways. The very same joy that informs learning about history, science, or culture in the real world, or, as another way of putting it, the world-building of our own reality. Really, from that perspective, all that's required to enjoy world-building in video games is an open enough mind to appreciate it on levels beyond the surface, and the humility to admit that not being able to know everything is sometimes what makes it fun. As for enjoying the world-building of planet Earth, well, let's just say that all you really need to know is that it all began in the 13th Age of Chaos, where Lord High Exarch Thalamidius the Shadow's Bane began his greatest crusade against the Riverlands. Hello, and welcome to this, the After the Video segment. What is that? Well, it's the part of every video where I reward you for making it all the way to the end, and /or for leaving the video playing in the background, by telling you all about the secret post-game content, which is to say, some cool internet things that you should be taking a look at. First up is a website and team of writers by the name of Aftermath. It should be no surprise to anyone that's been paying attention to the news that over the past few years, games journalism has been absolutely gutted by the greedy venture capitalists that control the world, and as a result, the industry has become a shadow of its former self, and nowadays it's basically just a clickbait farm. However, that's not stopped a couple of scrappy, independent teams who care about things like journalistic integrity and paying people properly from trying to rebuild things from the ground up, and Aftermath are some of the best in the biz. A lot of the core team have worked on some of the biggest gaming sites on the internet, and they've carried that expertise into some great writing that's finally free from the shackles of chasing ad revenue and needing to cozy up to big publishers. They are great, and if you like good games writing, please check them out. And if you're looking for something else to check out, might I recommend my patrons, who you should be bowing to in the street and offering your firstborns to like the miserable curs that you are. Without my patrons, my channel and videos like this simply wouldn't exist. And so take it from me when I say that the tiniest amount of support makes all the difference. $1 from one person for 1 month is worth more money for the channel than you will ever generate from ad revenue alone, and that's not even considering all the cool bonus stuff you get, like extra game design goodness, behind the scenes content, earlier access to videos, and my eternal permission to ad block my videos. Except, maybe don't tell YouTube about that last one. Shh! Additionally, patrons also get their name in the credits, some generous people off to the side, and the most generous of all in a now weirdly iconic big spoken list right at the end. Who are those people? Well, they are Ali Wright, Andrew Lebrano, Auna94, Bobby, Bodybuilding Baby Balbon, Brennan Spalding, Brian Notariani, Constantine Amend, Cosmix360, Daniel Medjes, Dirk Jan Karrenbelt, Dirk Karen Janbeld, Jesus Christ, thanks for making this as confusing as possible for me, whoever did that, Digleteer, Dis Ellie, Ecton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Space Bun, Eric Walston, Eugene Bulkin, Gazkull, Grandpa Mocker, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Kevin Help Us, Konolov, Kangi, Luke Kokoran, Macewinder54, Marika Vladalina Altair, Mark Vallant, May Contain Fox-Like Substance, Mika Oi, Mike Oxlong, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Reddidex, Regal Regex, Ray's Dad, Silver Fulfi, Steamrollerman, Steve Riley, Tyler Duncan, Uprising, Von Boomslang, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and Ciao. Okay, that's it, that's all. See you around. Bye!